China has gained control of multiple strategic assets of many countries across the world, one of which is so crucial that it controls 80% of global trade. The control of these assets has even put the economy and sovereignty of many countries in danger.
Belt and Road.
Belt and Road. Belt and Road.
Model after the original Silk Road.
Developing countries will be at the center of that.
Connect Asia, Africa, and Europe.
What's ahead for Belt and Road?
China has gained control over multiple ports across the world. But this turn of events didn't happen overnight. China has been working on this for years. Ports form a critical part of the global supply chain, and when you control the ports, you have control over global trade, which is exactly what China is doing. As of 2023, China has stakes in more than 92 ports across the world. And let me tell you that these do not include the ports in China itself. This is an extremely alarming situation, not only for the countries with the Chinese ports, but for global trade itself. On top of that, in the name of infrastructure development, China is turning many of these ports into its naval bases, a huge threat for every country in the region. But countries have started realizing these threats, and many have even started backing off from these projects. China initially had 101 overseas port projects, but as of 2023, this number has dropped to 92 projects, 9 less port projects than they wanted. Each of these 9 had its own reasons to be canceled or suspended. So, in this video, let's see how China gained control of some of the most critical ports of the world, why it's a huge threat for the countries with these Chinese ports, and how these countries are fighting to stop the Chinese takeover. But before we start with the video, please hit that like button below, because any video on the CCP has a potential to be downvoted by CCP bots, so your likes help out the video a lot. Thank you. As of 2022, global trade hit a record value of $32 trillion. Surprisingly, more than 80% of global trade, which translates to almost $25.6 trillion worth of goods, was carried by sea. This percentage is even higher for many developing countries, and these goods need ports to be offloaded. This is the reason why ports form an integral part of the global supply chain. In fact, ports even act as a lifeline for many countries. For example, Yemen, a country which is facing one of the largest humanitarian crises, imports 90% of its food through its ports. In fact, 90% of the entire African continent's imports and exports are driven by sea. This is not just limited to the African continent. Ukraine is one of the largest exporters of wheat in the world. In the 8 months before the conflict, it shipped around 50 million tons worth of grain through its ports in the Black Sea, a quantity enough to feed around 400 million people. And these are just a few examples of how important ports are for nations and global trade. Now, imagine letting go of the control of the most critical ports of your country to Chinese companies. It seems scary, right? This is what China has done and continues to do with many countries. As of 2023, there are 92 ports with Chinese ownership, 13 of them majority owned by China, and 10 of these projects even have the potential for military use, which means China is planning to dock its naval vessels in these ports. China has been gaining the control of these ports with various methods, the most popular of which still remains the most notorious one. I'm sure you must have guessed it. John Adams, the American statesman, once said, "There are 2 ways to conquer and enslave a nation. One is by the sword, the other is by debt." And China is doing the latter. The Belt and Road Initiative, infamously known for lending heavily to countries, especially developing and underdeveloped ones, for their infrastructure projects. When a country fails to repay these loans, the Chinese companies will take control of strategic assets in that country. One of the most notorious cases is what China has done with Sri Lanka. China literally forced Sri Lanka to surrender a strategically located 4,000-acre port in the Indian Ocean region, along with 15,000 acres of surrounding land. China's dream of claiming such a critical spot in the Indian Ocean region would have remained just a dream without the Sri Lankan president and a few other politicians. This is a story of greed, power, and dominance. This is the story of the Hambantota port. The Hambantota port is located in one of the most strategic locations in the world. It sits on the key shipping route between the Malacca Strait and the Suez Canal, which is the shortest and the most crucial trade route linking Asia and Europe. Back then, around 36,000 ships, including 4,500 oil tankers, used the route every year, with Colombo Port, Sri Lanka's largest port, located 200 kilometers from Hambantota Port, catering mainly to container ships. The Sri Lankan government saw a big opportunity here. They decided to build Hambantota Port to provide other services to international shipping, including refueling, repair work, and facilities for changing crews. But Sri Lanka didn't have enough funds to completely fund the project on its own, so it asked for help. But most of the countries rejected lending to Sri Lanka, since the country's economy was already in turmoil. Most countries saw the Hambantota Port as a commercially unviable project. This is where everyone's beloved and dear friend came to help Sri Lanka. You've already guessed it, it's the generous state of China. China has invested in a lot of long-term projects in Sri Lanka, including Hambantota Port. China gave out a $1.3 billion loan to Sri Lanka for this port. As usual, this port witnessed the same pattern every BRI project witnesses. The company that got the contract was a Chinese company. The inducted workers were Chinese. And these workers were paid from the same money China had lent to Sri Lanka for this port. So technically, most of the money was flowing back to China. If we talk about the port, 85% of the funds, around $1.3 billion required for the project, were lent by China. And the remaining 15% were given by the SLPA, or Sri Lanka Ports Authority, making the project an overall $1.5 billion project. The construction was carried out by China Harbor Engineering Company and the Sino Hydro Corporation, both of which are Chinese companies. The construction of the port began in 2008, and it's Phase 1, for which China generously charged an interest rate of 6.3% as compared to 1.2% rates offered by the IMF and the World Bank. Why Sri Lanka still accepted the loans is something we'll discuss in detail in later parts of the video, but for now, let's go back to Sri Lanka's story. So, Phase 1 of the project was completed in 2010, with port operations beginning in 2011. Phase 2 of the project began in 2012 and was completed by 2015. The port was fully fledged, ready to tap the huge opportunity it had. But things didn't really go as planned. The Hambantota port was failing. The Hambantota port was unable to generate sufficient revenue due to inadequate governance, lack of commercial and industrial activities, and its inability to attract passing vessels to dock at the port. This was mostly because the ships chose the more advanced Colombo port instead of the Hambantota port, which was just 200 kilometers away from it. When the first phase of the port became operational, it attracted only 34 ships in 2012, as compared to 3,667 ships at the Colombo port. After the construction of the second phase, the situation didn't really improve. On average, the port witnessed visits by only about 400 vessels annually, as compared to average of 4,000 vessels annually by the Port of Colombo. The port started suffering losses. By the end of 2016, total losses had mounted to $304 million, while the debt was ballooning. Sri Lanka had to repay nearly $1.7 billion to China as principal and interest for the loan. The debt repayment for this loan around 2015 was close to about $100 million annually. Well, guess what? Our dear friend China came along once again and, using the pretext of recurring losses, designed a public-private partnership scheme to manage and operate the port. Sri Lanka had no option but to take one of the most difficult decisions it had ever taken. In December of 2016, the Sri Lankan government decided to restructure the port, in collaboration with China Merchants Port Holdings Company, or CM Port, to make it commercially viable. Two new entities were created: the Hambantota International Port Group, HIPG, and Hambantota International Port Services Company Limited, HIPS. Now, HIPG would develop and manage the port along with the adjoining land, while HIPS would operate the port services. The Chinese entity, CM Port, invested $1.12 billion for the acquisition of an 85% stake in HIPG and a 52% stake in HIPS, with the remaining stakes given to the Sri Lankan Port Authority. This brought the total Chinese ownership in the Hambantota port to about 70%. So now China had the majority ownership of this project, and it also has the authority to operate the port. But for how many years? Is it 10, 20, or 30 years? Well, none of these. China leased the port for 99 friggin' years. Yeah, you heard that right, 99 years. But the twist doesn't end there. Interestingly, there was no change in Sri Lanka's debt obligations for this project, even after the Chinese acquisition. This is because China didn't waive off the loan in exchange for the port, but instead invested $1.2 billion for the acquisition, with these funds sent to the Sri Lankan treasury, which it may have used for other purposes. While taking over the port, both HIPG and HIPS, the entities with majority Chinese stake, did not inherit any liability. And so the government of Sri Lanka is still liable for the debt and still continues to repay the debt despite handing over the port to China. And that is how China gained control over a strategic port for not 10, not 20, but 99 years. Now, you must be wondering, during all this chaos, wasn't the Sri Lankan leadership aware of these Chinese tactics? Well, it turns out that the Sri Lankan leadership at that time was completely aware of these Chinese tactics. And there was one person who was responsible for all of this chaos. In fact, under his leadership, from 2005 to 2015, the country's debt increased threefold, from $15 billion to $44.8 billion. This is where one of China's ugliest strategies comes into play. That is, to bribe the decision makers and make sure they stay in power as long as possible. In the case of Sri Lanka, China bribed the leadership to such an extent that the president of Sri Lanka was literally called a puppet of China. Every major decision he took was heavily influenced by China. This man, who stayed in power for 10 years and literally destroyed Sri Lanka's economy, was none other than Mahinda Rajapaksa.
Mahinda Rajapaksa looked invincible. His grip on power was absolute. He controlled the parliament. His family controlled 75% of the country's budget.
During Mr. Rajapaksa's tenure, he and his three brothers controlled many government ministries and around 80% of total government spending. So it became easy for China to bribe them and get things done in favor of Chinese interests. The influence of China grew so much that the Chinese entities got their work done without any hassles and at exorbitant prices. This is because during the construction of the Hambantota port, there was a large boulder that partially blocked the entrance, which prevented large ships like oil tankers from entering the port. But during construction, this was not taken into consideration. The port was built, and in 2010, on Rajapaksa's birthday, this port was open for ships despite nothing being done about this boulder. Only a year later, China Harbor blasted the boulder. But what was fishy was the cost of blasting this boulder. China Harbor charged an astonishing $40 million to do this job. This gave rise to many speculations whether the company was overcharging or this price tag included kickbacks to Rajapaksa. In another case, Rajapaksa approved an international airport named Matala Rajapaksa International Airport, which was financed by China's EXIM Bank. This project was bound to fail because just $6,000 were spent on the airport's feasibility study. But more than $80,000 was spent on a lavish ceremony that included dancers and singers to prematurely open Hambantota Port on Rajapaksa's birthday. This shows Mr. Rajapaksa's dedication towards China. And well, China didn't stop here. China also tried to influence the elections in Sri Lanka. According to a government investigation, during the 2015 elections in Sri Lanka, large payments from the Chinese Port Construction Fund flowed directly to campaign aids and activities for Rajapaksa's party. Around $7.6 million were transferred from China Harbour's account to affiliates of Rajapaksa's campaign. And as we saw, China Harbour is the same company that built Hambantota Port. In fact, just 10 days before the elections, around $3.7 million was distributed in checks, which were used for promotional activity, distributing gifts to people, and funding popular figures who were supporting Rajapaksa's party. Guess what? Most of the payments were made from a sub-account controlled by none other than China Harbour. Well, Sri Lanka isn't the only country. China has been doing this in many countries. Some of these attempts failed miserably because China was caught offering bribes. One of them is actually extremely hilarious. In Bangladesh, China Harbour was accused of bribing an official at the Ministry of Roads. They did this by stuffing $100,000 into a tea box. And while that sounds funny, it's just China things, you know? In the end, Bangladesh banned China Harbour from securing any future contracts. The second incident took place in 2009 in the Philippines, where China Harbour's parent company, China Communications Construction Company, was banned for 8 years from bidding on World Bank projects because of corrupt practices. Coming back to the Sri Lanka story, Mahinda Rajapaksa put Sri Lanka's economy in a fragile situation, with anti-Chinese and anti-Rajapaksa sentiments extremely high. The opposition party leader, Maithripala Sirisena, won the election because he promised to kick China out of the country and cancel many Chinese projects. As he promised, he canceled many Chinese projects and tried to bring Sri Lanka on track. But the damage was already too high, which not only impacted Sri Lanka, but also became a concern for China's biggest rival in the region, India.
Experts call the Yuan Wong 5 a spy ship. 222 meters long, about 25 meters wide. It has at least 4 satellites and multiple antennas. The Yuan Wong ships can in fact track ballistic missile trajectories. They can monitor satellite and space vehicle launches, and that's what makes these ships a critical part of China's missile and space program. The US Defense Department says these ships belong to the PLA's Strategic Support Force. A challenge to India, this vessel can be used to spy on multiple strategic assets in India. The Indian Navy is believed to be keeping a close eye on the Chinese ship. India and Sri Lanka are deepening ties, but clearly that's not enough to counter the Chinese influence effectively. Try to look at this from Sri Lanka's point of view. It must keep both India and China in good humor. It needs a bailout from the IMF. Sri Lanka needs that money urgently, and that will not happen until China restructures its loans to Sri Lanka.
On the 16th of August, 2022, a Chinese ship named Yuan Wang 5 entered the Hambantota port. Sri Lanka and China referred to this ship as a scientific research ship. Well, the USA and India became extremely cautious after this move. This ship was operated by the PLA Strategic Support Force, who used it for military purposes, despite being registered as a marine scientific research vessel. Later, it turned out that this ship's actual purpose was to track satellites and missiles with a range of 750 kilometers, which means it had the ability to track activities in multiple Indian states in the south. Later, other Chinese ships and submarines were also welcomed by Sri Lanka in Hambantota. So, China has gained 2 crucial advantages through this port. One, it has gotten access to one of the most critical ports in the Indian Ocean region, very near to the most critical trade route, the route between the Suez Canal and the Malacca Strait. This is because roughly 80% of China's entire oil supply and roughly 90% of overall Chinese trade passes through the Malacca Strait, which China always fears that India might block the Malacca Strait choke point in case of a conflict. If this happens, you can just imagine this situation in China. This is the reason China has taken a lot of steps to safeguard its oil supplies, one of which is the Hambantota port. Number 2, this port has become a key part of China's string of pearls strategy, a network of ports and military infrastructure China is building to encircle its biggest rival in the Indian Ocean region, India. Hambantota is one of the closest points, being located just a few hundred kilometers from India. Though things are changing, with the USA and India taking multiple steps to beat China in the Indian Ocean region. We will discuss all these in a few moments, but before that, let's have a look at how China used the debt trap strategy for another country not too far from Sri Lanka, where it repeated the same thing. The country was on the verge of bankruptcy. No one was ready to fund big amounts of their infrastructure projects, so China lent them a huge amount of money. As usual, they failed to repay and had no choice but to hand over their assets to China, including a strategically located port, for 40 years. This country is none other than Pakistan.
Beijing is developing Gwadar as part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor known as CPEC.
Since gaining independence, Pakistan has been extremely unstable politically. Sometimes the head of state is an elected leader. Sometimes it's a military general who snatched power with a military coup. This instability became a major reason why no companies are willing to invest significantly in Pakistan. In this power struggle, Pakistan's economy went for a toss. It faced bankruptcy several times, and so it approached the IMF for bailout packages. Not for one, not for two, but 12 freaking times. Though it received these funds, they were meant for Pakistan's survival, not to spend on expensive infrastructure projects. Pakistan was not able to spend on its infrastructure development. Well, China was paying attention, and they saw a huge opportunity in this troubled nation. In 2015, it came with a massive regional connectivity project called the CPEC, or China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is a part of China's BRI. Initially, CPEC had projects worth $46 billion, but as of 2017 has increased to $62 billion, with this number still expected to increase. These numbers looked really good on paper, but as you know, the contracting companies were Chinese. Their workers were Chinese, and once again, most of the money went back to China. In 2002, China Harbor Construction Company built Phase 1 of the Gwadar port at a cost of $248 million, completing it in 2006. The estimated cost of the second phase was $840 million, with most of the funding coming from China. Well, what happened next? You must be thinking that a Chinese company took the port on lease, right? Actually, no. In fact, you'd be surprised to know that in 2007, Pakistan granted the management of this port to PSA, or the Port of Singapore Authority, for a period of 40 years. Not just that. According to the agreement, the PSA also agreed to invest $550 million during the next 5 years for the port development. The Gwadar Port Authority was all set to receive 9% from cargo operations and marine services, and 15% from Gwadar Free Zone business. Even many import duties and taxes were waived off. So it was a win-win situation for everyone. The Chinese influence was countered, Pakistan got funds to develop a port, and also a business alongside it. But in 2013, Pakistan made such a decision that sent shockwaves across almost every country.
The award of this contract opens new opportunities for our people, particularly for the people of Balochistan. It gives new impetus to Pakistan-China relations.
In 2013, the management of Gwadar Port was handed over to a Chinese company named China Overseas Ports Holding Company for 43 years. According to geopolitical experts, Pakistan took this move to balance US influence in the country and to seek Beijing's more active support. This is because there were tensions between the US and Pakistan over America's policies in Afghanistan. 2 years later, the Gwadar Port became part of the CPEC, under which China planned to extend the port's capacity and infrastructure connecting the port. China proposed expanding the current capacity of the port, which could currently handle ships weighing up to 20,000 tons, to accommodate vessels weighing up to 70,000 tons, including a floating liquefied natural gas terminal with a capacity of 500 million cubic feet of gas per day, a desalination plant, and a 2,292-acre special economic zone. In total, $1.62 billion was projected to be spent on this new infrastructure. Here too, China would take away most of the benefits. According to the agreement, Chinese port operator COPHC will get a 91% share of the revenue from the operations of the port and terminal, and 85% of the revenue generated by the free zone. Though the port is expected to handle 1 million tons of cargo annually and generate a lot of business, Pakistan would hardly receive any benefits out of it. This port is also a savior for China, since it safeguards China's energy needs. Well, how's this, you might ask? Well, it has two major reasons. One, the main reason is again the same, the Malacca Strait choke point. With this port, China can skip this choke point to a large extent and directly transport crude oil and other energy resources from Pakistan's Gwadar port to Kashgar province in China via roadways. Number two, this port is located just 600 kilometers from the Strait of Hormuz. If you haven't heard about it, it's the same choke point through which 20% of the world's crude oil and liquefied fuels pass. So having a military setup in Gwadar port acts as a deterrence against rivals of China, the major one of which is India in this region. Even this port acts as a pearl in China's string of pearls strategy. These are the major reasons why this port is so critical for China. In fact, China is so concerned about it that in 2017, it gifted 2 Chinese ships to the Pakistan Navy to safeguard the Gwadar port and adjoining trade routes. Later, 2 more ships were also provided to Pakistan. Similarly, China is going head-on with the US in the South China Sea. Some of the ports that can play a critical role in favor of China could be the Newcastle Port, Melbourne Port, and Darwin Port in Australia, ports in the Philippines, Timor-Leste, the Saigon Port in Vietnam, and its port projects in Malaysia, Singapore, and South Korea. In fact, the most concerning case of all of this is that in 2015, Australia's Darwin Port was given on a 99-year lease to a Chinese company, Land Bridge Group. Later, the US showed concerns regarding this move, so Australia reviewed the project and decided not to cancel this lease. Unfortunately, this is the level of influence China has. Chinese use of these ports can be detrimental, not just to the United States, but to these countries too. For instance, we witnessed the recent incident of the Chinese fighter jets encircling a Philippine aircraft during a joint patrol with Australia.
The Armed Forces of the Philippines confirms Chinese fighter jets orbited above the Philippines' Super Tucanos during its joint air patrol with Australia over the West Philippine Sea. The circling lasted for about 15 minutes and the mission was completed without incident last Sunday, November 26. The day before the incident, AFP Chief General Romeo Bronner Jr. said Chinese vessels shadowed Philippine and Australian ships during joint maritime patrols in the West Philippine Sea. The AFP chief says this seems to be China's tactic, pointing out that Chinese vessels had earlier circled US and Japanese aircrafts flying over the area on a separate occasion.
China regularly keeps bullying smaller countries in some way or another. Anyway, coming back to the ports, on the Asian continent, along with all these ports, China either has stakes or handles port operations in 10 more countries that include Papua New Guinea, North Korea, Russia, Bangladesh, Myanmar, the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Israel, and Turkey, with Chinese investments ranging anywhere between $30 million to more than $1 billion. Similarly, in the case of the African continent, China has investments in not 1, not 10, but in over 24 ports across more than 10 countries, with a total value of $20.347 billion USD. The most concerning aspect of these ports is that some of them are located very close to the world's most critical choke points, the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. As you know, 30 to 35% of the world's crude oil passes through these choke points. So China clearly is a threat to the world. Now, you may ask, if China is such a huge threat to the sovereignty of its borrowers, if China has and still is relentlessly distributing loans to debt-trapped countries, with so many infamous cases of debt trap out there, why are countries still borrowing from China? In fact, many countries have ditched the IMF and the World Bank and borrowed from Chinese banks. Well, you'll be surprised to know that the interest rates of the World Bank and the IMF are around 1 to 2% with a maturity period of around 25 to 30 years. China, on the other hand, offers an interest rate of 4 to 6% and a maturity period of just 15 to 20 years. According to a report, China has lent around $1.34 trillion between 2000 and 2021 to more than 165 countries, especially low and middle-income countries. China is so cunning that they initially lend for infrastructure projects. And when the borrower countries struggle to repay these loans and need emergency rescue loans, guess who offers these loans to them? It's China, in case you didn't get that. So, ironically, China first offered huge infrastructure loans to poor countries, and then came again with a rescue loan just because they were struggling to repay them. These rescue loans increased to 58% of China's lending to low and middle-income countries in 2021, compared to just 5% in 2013. Now, there are 3 major reasons why so many countries prefer borrowing from China. And if you've already watched our video on how China is destroying countries with its dams, then you kind of already know these reasons. But if you haven't, here are the major reasons. Number 1. First, the IMF and the World Bank does not provide huge loans to countries with weak economic conditions, especially for expensive infrastructure projects. In fact, the IMF discourages poor countries from taking large commercial loans. But in the case of China, it was offering huge ticket-sized loans. So clearly, many countries just chose China. The second reason is the neoliberal and stringent conditionality of the IMF. So if a country asks for an IMF loan, then the country has to agree to the multiple IMF conditions. These include open markets, scrapping government subsidies, deregulating key sectors, privatization, and debt management. Also, the IMF would ask low-income countries to seek debt relief before they took on new loans. And countries must abide by a debt limit framework to benefit from debt relief. So this was a headache for these poor countries. But again, China has nothing to do with where the country's economy is going and what it should and shouldn't do with their economy. So again, these low-income countries choose Chinese lenders. The third reason why countries prefer China is because China offered them something called the mixed funding model option. In this model, China lends huge amounts to low-income countries for infrastructure if reimbursement can be guaranteed by lucrative commercial projects like oil, mines, or revenues from exports. The infrastructure is then developed as long as the commercial project remains profitable. So basically, instead of just paying back with regular money, these countries promise to share some of the money they make from projects like selling oil, minerals, or profits from other ventures. Experts call this model the resource-backed lending model. This model is primarily used in poor countries that are rich in natural resources. China first applied the mixed funding model in a war-torn African country called Angola. During 2004 to 2010, Angola received around $10 billion from China's Exim Bank, with its oil as collateral. Later, China replicated this model in various countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 2007. Where the loans backed by mineral exports continue to finance infrastructure projects in the DRC. Guinea in 2017, too, entered into a bauxite-backed financing agreement with Industrial and Commercial Bank of China and the China Exim Bank for $587 million for its 2 road projects. In fact, projects up to $30 billion have been signed in several African countries under this model. Along with this, China is always willing to accept repayment in alternative forms like geopolitical favors or acquiring strategic assets of that country. For example, China converted a $230 million loan into grants for the construction of the Gwadar International Airport, which provided China the sole right to construct the airport instead of relying on competitive bidding processes. Compare that to the IMF and other financial institutions who stay out of these shady agreements and prefer to receive payments only in cash. These are the major reasons why borrowing from China looks like a win-win situation at a first glance. And if you're thinking that only Asian and African countries get attracted to these loans, then take a look at this map. If you notice, it includes 12 port projects on the European continent, including 2 ports in Spain, 3 in Ukraine, and 1 in Germany, Latvia, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Italy, and Greece. All these ports handle about 10% of Europe's shipping container capacity. Here, the Chinese stakes in the Zeebrugge port in Belgium and the Mykolaiv port in Ukraine have even reached 100%. Surprisingly, 3 of these countries, namely Ukraine, Latvia, and Greece, are even BRI signatories. In fact, Chinese loans to European countries almost quadrupled to 23% from 2018 to 2021. And it's not just that. Chinese loans have reached the South and North American continents as well, with investments in 10 port projects in countries like Chile, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Panama, the Bahamas, Mexico, and 2 port terminals here in the US. In fact, some of these ports handle some of the highest traffic volumes for those countries. For example, in Brazil, the port of Paranaguá receives the 3rd highest amount of traffic, and shockingly, China has a 90% stake in this port. Similarly, 60% of the Chancay port in Peru is owned by China, which is clearly dangerous for these countries. Among all the ports we mentioned, one of the most infamous cases, apart from the Hambantota port, that not only made headlines worldwide a few years ago, but also demonstrates the influence China has on a continent, is located in Europe. This port is one of the most critical ports in Europe, and the world was shocked when China acquired a controlling stake in the largest port of Greece, the 7th largest port in Europe, the Piraeus port. The story begins in 2015, when Greece was grappling with a massive debt crisis. It also missed a 1.6 billion euro payment to the IMF, making it the first developed nation to have missed such a payment. This was a time when no one was interested in investing in Greece. And this is when China saw an opportunity. A Chinese company named COSCO, C-O-S-C-O, swept in and acquired a controlling stake in the Piraeus port. Well, this was not the first time COSCO was operating the Greek port. COSCO, boy, it's gonna throw me off to be calling it that, first secured the right to operate parts of Piraeus in 2008. Later, during Greece's economic crisis, it acquired 51% of the port in 2016, and again increased it to 67% in October of 2021. So, as of now, COSCO has the majority stake, which means the Chinese shipping company can decide the future of the port. Because of the location, this port serves as China's gateway into Europe and the Middle East. Surprisingly, after COSCO started handling the port in 2008, the container volume rose by almost 7 times in the next 10 years, to 5.65 million TEU, or 20-foot equivalent units, which is basically a standard unit of measure, often used in marine cargo transport. In fact, this port became one of the fastest-growing ports in the world. Additionally, COSCO claims that this port provided direct and indirect employment to over 10,000 people. So, everything seems fine, right? Thousands of people are getting employed and the port is doing very well, and that too with Chinese investment. Actually, we only saw one side of this story. According to Giorgos Gogos, leader of a workers' union at Piraeus, the working conditions have worsened after China's entry into Piraeus. Also, according to Giorgos, the workers at Piraeus receive no safety training, resulting in multiple accidents happening at the port. In October of 2021, the port's unions called a 24-hour strike after one worker died when he was struck by a container crane. On top of that, most of the workers were hired on contract basis, leaving them with no job security. And in addition to all of this, even employees at senior positions were replaced by Chinese employees. According to Marcos, a worker at the port, whenever the workforce tried to raise a voice against all these practices, they were fired by COSCO. So the workers were too scared to speak up. Sometimes these workers even worked the whole shift without taking any breaks. He also mentioned that, at times, his co-workers had to urinate in plastic bottles. Such was the pathetic conditions of the workers at the Piraeus port. On top of that, most of the equipment and materials used in COSCO-led construction at Piraeus port were imported from China. So again, most of the funds just went back to China. From a geopolitical angle, the Chinese presence is a huge threat to the region. Bordering the Mediterranean Sea on the south and the Balkan Peninsula on the north, Piraeus is one of the closest Mediterranean ports on the European continent to the Suez Canal, Gibraltar main shipping routes. It also has railway connection to the hinterland of Central and Eastern Europe, and as you know, the Suez Canal is the same passage through which 12% of goods worth more than $1 trillion pass through this route. And it's not only about trade. About 20 million passengers go through Piraeus each year. Its strategic location makes it an important port in the Mediterranean. So, China has an excellent opportunity to get a foothold in Europe through this port. Considering China's stake, China can use this port as a deterrent pretty much any time. Although the chances seem very low because of global pressure, but still, the chances, it can't be ignored. And I'm not just guessing it out of thin air here. The Chinese Navy has played this card before. In July 2017, the Chinese naval fleet, including a missile destroyer, a missile frigate, and a supply vessel, paid a visit to the Piraeus port. But hold on. These were incidents from the past. It's 2024 now, and things have changed. And are changing drastically. The countries that were once trapped in China's debt have shown massive resistance to China. Countries are opting out of the BRI. Many of them have banned Chinese companies. They are showing strong resistance to Chinese bullying. It seems the world has learned to contain the dragon. And it's not just the big countries. Even the smaller countries are standing firmly against the dragon's might. The same Greece, which once sold a controlling stake to China out of a compulsion, later blocked a Chinese company named China's State Grid from bidding on power distribution projects. Now, this happened in January of 2021, when Greece allowed companies to bid for a 49% stake in the country's mid to low voltage distribution network operator. The Chinese company, China's State Grid, already held a 24% stake in Greece's high voltage independent power transmission operator, but it wanted more. Greece didn't want the Chinese ownership to reach dangerous levels, so it straight away blocked the Chinese entity. And Greece didn't stop here. It also disqualified another Chinese state-owned enterprise, South Power Grid, from participating in the bid. In the case of the port, too, the decision to sell the stake to a Chinese firm has been backfiring. It has been facing a lot of opposition from the locals in the region, with the major reasons being poor work conditions and the involvement of a foreign company. Costco's plans to build a new hotel, mall, and other facilities in the port area have been delayed, and Costco has blamed this delay on Greece's complex administrative requirements and local opposition. On the other hand, according to Greece, the expansion has been delayed because Greece refused to accept the environmental studies provided by Costco, calling them insufficient. And we all know how much China cares about the environment, especially when it comes to a foreign country. On top of that, the people living near the port are trying to stop Costco's plans through legal action. So clearly China is facing huge opposition in the European country. In the same continent, another country made a decision that proved to be a huge setback for Chinese influences in Europe.
The Italians are moving away from Xi Jinping's pet project, the flagship Belt and Road Initiative. Italy has confirmed that it will pull out of China's flagship Belt and Road Initiative, and Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's administration notified Beijing that it would cease participating in the BRI.
Yes, you heard it right. The only G7 country which once joined the BRI, Italy, is no longer a part of the BRI. On the 21st of April, 2023, Italian PM Meloni confirmed that Italy intended to exit the BRI. And finally, on December 6, 2023, just 4 years after joining the BRI, the Italian government formally announced that Italy will not renew the 2019 Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, regarding its formal participation in China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. This wasn't the only blow to China in Europe. Just a year ago, in 2022, Estonia and Latvia quit the China 17+1 group, which was an initiative by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs to promote business and investment relations between China and Europe. In 2021, it was Lithuania which not only left 17+1, but also urged other European countries to leave. In fact, Lithuania, a country with a population of less than 3 million, did a thing that even some of the most powerful countries on the planet would hesitate to do. It started strengthening its ties with Taiwan, to such an extent that China has even banned Lithuanian products from entering the Chinese market. In fact, Lithuania has even scheduled a visit of its 11 MPs to meet Taiwan's newly elected president this year. Now, if you think it's just Europe who's slaying the dragon, oh, you're wrong. The African continent, once a bastion for Chinese loans, is now slowly and steadily turning its back on China. The Chinese loans to African countries fell from 31% of the total in 2018 to just 12% in 2021. In fact, the Chinese loan commitments to Africa, which peaked to $28 billion in 2016, fell to just $11 billion in 2018, $1.9 billion as of 2020, and dropped to $995 million in 2022. The major reasons behind this are falling demand for Chinese debt, economic slowdown, and China's own economic problems. This is why, as you can see in the graph, the World Bank overtook Chinese lenders in 2017, with its loans shooting up from almost $7 billion in 2010 to more than $30 billion in 2022. When it comes to the ports, the $10 billion Bagamoyo port project in Tanzania, which was signed in 2013 between China and Tanzania, almost got canceled by Tanzania's then-president, John Magufuli, in 2019, because he believed the project was meant to exploit Tanzania. Unfortunately, Tanzania's new president, Samia Suluhu Hassan, decided to revive this project. In the case of Asia, where China has invested billions of dollars with hope to reap huge benefits, China is either witnessing cancellation of projects or its own projects are backfiring. For instance, Pakistan's Gwadar port, where China has spent billions in hopes of decreasing their reliance on the Malacca Strait, the project could potentially fail. This is because even if the Pakistani government couldn't oppose the Chinese investment to a large extent, the locals in the region have literally started revolting against the Chinese. In fact, the whole region, known as Balochistan, is a highly unstable region. And this is not only about China and its projects. The rebel groups in this region are also against the Pakistani army, because Pakistan has never focused on the development of the Balochistan province, even though they keep extracting natural resources from the region. Considering these issues, China built a school, sent doctors, and promised some $500 million for the construction of a hospital, a college, and various infrastructure projects to supply the city with drinking water. Pakistan even deployed around 12,000 soldiers to protect the Chinese workers. But still, the attacks have not stopped on the Pakistani army or the workers involved on various infrastructure projects linked to CPEC. Another reason why this port could fail is because it passes through Kashmir, another highly unstable region. This region is claimed by India, who called Pakistan's presence an illegal occupation. According to military experts, India could potentially recapture this region very soon, cutting off China's access. If this happens, China's billions of dollars might go in vain. Moving our focus to Myanmar, China planned to build the Chaukpu port project at a cost of $7 billion. But later, Myanmar itself decreased this amount to $1.3 billion. China's investment in the project was reduced because Myanmar was aware of Chinese debt traps, and they didn't want to fall for it. Even so, Myanmar took $1.3 billion because its economy was already weak and it really had no other options. But this incident indicates that countries are becoming aware of these Chinese debt traps, and many other nations are canceling Chinese debt. Samoa, a small country in the South Pacific Ocean, also decided to cancel a $100 million Chinese-backed port development in 2021, calling it an excessive amount for the small Pacific island that is already in heavy debt to China. China is also present in Israel's Haifa port. Haifa is one of the main seaports in Israel, where about 99% of all goods move in and out of the country by sea. China's Shanghai International Port Group already operates a port at Haifa. So to counter it, Israel has awarded a major contract to an Indian company named Adani Ports in 2022. Adani Ports acquired a major part of the port for $1.13 billion for operations. Sri Lanka is tackling China with the help of other major economies. The US is investing more than $500 million in a port terminal in Colombo, which is being developed by Indian Adani Ports. The financing by the American government's International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, is being seen as America's move to counter China's influence in South Asia. In fact, this is the biggest investment so far in Asia by the DFC. And on top of that, Adani signed a $700 million build, operate, transfer deal in 2021 with the Sri Lankan Ports Authority to develop and run the strategic Colombo Port's Western Container Terminal. Similarly, India has assisted Sri Lanka with $3.8 billion, which includes currency swaps, grants, credit lines, humanitarian supplies, and infrastructure development. To reciprocate this help, Sri Lanka canceled Chinese projects in the Jaffna Peninsula. They allowed India to invest in the energy sector and built a free-floating dock facility, Maritime Rescue Coordination Center. Surprisingly, one of the subunits of this MRCC will also be installed in the China-operated Hambantota port. A similar story is happening in Bangladesh, where India and Japan have joined hands to counter China. India and Japan have decided to develop a port named Matabari Port in Bangladesh, which would be a deep-sea port that would help not only Bangladesh, but also India and Japan in connectivity. Looking forward, only time will tell what future steps other countries will take to counter China.